Hello, everyone. We're going to wait for a few minutes to have people start. Thank you for joining. Thanks, everyone who's joined so far. We're going to give a few minutes for people to keep joining, and we'll get started. In the meantime, if you don't mind, it looks like a lot of you are taking the poll that's up. Thank you so much. It lets us know who's here. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to Advocates for Children's Placement Timelines for Students with IEPs. We're so happy you could join us. As you can see, we have an ASL interpreter here today, Marley. So thank you, Marley. And we also have Betty Baez-Mello is here and can answer questions in Spanish. We will be doing a Spanish webinar version of this soon.
Es solo para repetir en español. Gracias a todos por estar participando. Buenas tardes. Esta presentación hoy será en inglés, pero en el futuro lo vamos a ofrecer en español. Las personas que están participando hoy, si tienen preguntas, las pueden hacer en español en el chat y en el Q&A. Yo lo estaré contestando. Pero si necesitan toda la información en español, recomendamos que asisten a ese taller. Lo vamos a mandar correos electrónicos con más información. Gracias.
Okay, and thank you everyone who's taking the poll. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. One of the most common questions that come up is this recorded and can I get a copy of the slides? And the answer is yes and yes. We will have a copy of both on our website and we'll send out a link to that. So thank you so much for coming. I'm Kim Madden from Advocates for Children. I'm the Director of Family Support, and I'm joined by my colleague, Betty. Betty, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Betty Baez-Mello. I'm the Director of the Early Childhood Education Project at AFC.
And we're going to go through the slides and take some breaks for questions, but we'll also try to answer questions as we go. So if you can put your questions in the Q&A, that would be great. Okay, thanks. Okay. Okay, so for today's training, we'll go through we already did some introductions. We're going to talk about the difference between an IEP, an individualized education program, and a placement. We'll talk about 12-month placement timelines, 10-month placement timelines, and then problem solving, where we'll go through what happens. How do you know if a school has a small class, what to do if they don't, and some of the different remedies that might exist. So thank you. Okay, so first off, what is Advocates for Children? We're an independent agency and we protect the rights of all New York City students. We have a helpline that's open Monday through Thursday, 10 to 4, and we have people answering the phones who speak English and Spanish and we have a language line for other languages. We also have guides and resources available on our website. And a lot of today, we're really just focusing on placement today, but for students with IEPs, there's so many other issues that come up. So I certainly would encourage you to look on our website and look at the different resources there. We do a lot of workshops and trainings, and we also offer free legal services to low-income families. Okay, so the IEP program and placement, what's the difference? Sometimes these words get used very interchangeably. The program, which is the IEP, is the what? What are you getting? Your IEP might recommend general education or an integrated co-teaching or ICT class. A small class, it might have related services. We have a whole training on what an IEP is. That's on our website and how to go through each page of it. And so today we're focusing on placement, not program. You have a legal right to what's on the IEP program. So if they recommend an ICT or a small class under federal and state law, you have a right to that. The placement is the where. So it's the school location that can provide services and the program on your IEP. And you don't have a right to a particular placement, but you do have a right to a placement that can implement your IEP. When I was first starting in this field, somebody explained it that it's like saying you have a right to a one bedroom. In New York City, you would never just take a one bedroom without going to see it or to understand, does it have what you need? Is it a walk-up? Does it have an elevator? But the program is like the one bedroom, and the placement is actually where the apartment is. It's somewhat similar for the idea of what your student needs in theory, and then what they're going to be getting and where they're going to be getting it and every day when they're at school. And so to go through the types of programs that exist, we're going to go through the continuum of services. This is a pretty brief overview, so we have more in-depth trainings on this. But the first one, the least restrictive, is general education with supports and services. You can have an IEP that recommends general education and things like speech or physical therapy, etc. Then you can also have an integrated co-teaching. That's where you have one special ed teacher and one gen ed teacher, and they teach together. And the class includes students with IEPs and students without IEPs. Also, the next step down is a special class in a community school, meaning more restrictive or more supportive. And that could mean 12 students. These ratios, 12 students, 1 + 1 means one teacher and one aide. A 12-to-1 is 12 students and one teacher, and a 15-to-1 is in high school, and that's 15 students and one teacher. And then District 75, inclusion in a community school. These are all the services that you can get in what we call a District 1 through 32 school. There's always going to be students without disabilities in these schools. For younger grades, it might be where your zone school is. So this is this first group of schools and types of programs that are offered in those. More restrictive is District 75. In a District 75 school, it might be located in a building with students without disabilities, but all the students in a District 75 school have IEPs, and there's different kinds of programs available. So a 12-to-1-to-1, an 8-to-1-to-1, a 6-to-1-to-1, and a 12-to-1-to-4. These are different programs that, for example, 6-to-1-to-1 is often recommended for students with autism. A 12-to-1-to-4 is often recommended for students who have multiple disabilities. They might use a wheelchair and have autism, for example, or have an intellectual disability. So there are different kinds of programs that offer support to students with significant disabilities. There's also state-approved non-public schools. These are private schools, but they're private schools that can be put on your IEP. And there's a huge range of those. We'll go through a little bit more in depth how you get a placement in one of those. There's also residential placement. That's obviously very restrictive, where you're not living at home, you're living at the school. And then finally, home instruction, or now it's called medically required instruction, medically necessary instruction. Next up is this group of programs that sort of exists outside of that continuum that we went through, where you're going to be recommended for them outside the typical application process. And these include bilingual programs, bilingual special ed programs, ASD, NEST, and Horizon. These are specialized programs for students with autism. NEST is integrated in a District 1 through 32 school. Well, they both are, but ASD Nest is like an ICT class, but for students that have autism, and it has some special requirements with it. AIMS is another autism program. ACEs is a program for students with intellectual disabilities. iRead is a program for students with reading disabilities. PATH is a relatively new program for students with behavior issues. And finally, if you need a barrier-free or an accessible school, and that could be anywhere along the continuum, you could be in Gen Ed with SETS, you could be in a District 75 school in a 12 to 1 to 4. But if you need a school that's wheelchair accessible in New York City, obviously that's very limited, unfortunately. So to place you there, go through a different process. You obviously are entitled to a school that you can get into. Okay, so in terms of one of the questions that comes up a lot for us is on the non-public schools. So just to go through what some attributes of those are. You would be recommended for a non-public school if your needs can't be met in a public school program. These are schools that specialize in meeting particular needs. So classification, for example, they can only serve students with certain classifications. So sometimes for parents, and it makes sense, you may not pay that much attention to a classification. Your child could be classified as other health impaired, OHI, or having a learning disability, or speech and language impairment. In a community school, that may not matter that much, but for a non-public school, they're going to be limited to, they can only serve students with certain classifications. If your IEP recommends a non-public school, it will say defer to CBST. That's a branch of the DOE. It stands for Central Base Support Team, or NYSED approved non-public day program. And the CBST office is the office that would apply to NPS programs for you. So if my child was recommended for a non-public school, CBST would reach out based on the classification and age. But one thing we also tell parents is this list is available online. This is a hyperlink in the presentation. So when you get these slides, you can click on that purple box in the middle. And it often really makes sense as a parent to be applying on your own if you think that this is something your child needs, rather than waiting for CBST. Okay, and then finally, there's a lot of supports and services that can go into making an IEP program work for your child. So a lot of times I think we think of program as meaning only ICT or, special class, but it also can mean all these other things. So assistive technology, paraprofessionals, counseling, nursing, OT, PT, speech, SETs. For example, some students who were recommended for an ICT might do okay in general education if they had a lot of extra sets, or maybe they had a para, or maybe they had some AT combined. You're going to want to work with your school and your child best to figure out what they need. One thing I would say is the IEP should be based, or must be based, on what your child needs, not what a school has. And that's easy to say, and it sometimes is complicated to figure out. So you might really want a particular school, but they don't have the placement available now. And you can figure out, well, if I get all these other supports in there, will this work? And that's an individualized question. But you can also push for them to create the program your child needs. But that's something that is going to be very much on a case-by-case basis. If you're the only child in a school who needs a small class, they might be offering a different school. And so I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but these are some of the supports that can wrap around the main educational program and help support a student. Behavioral intervention plans, also very important for students with behavioral issues. And specialized transportation, that's also on the IEP, and something that we have another training on and fact sheets on if you need help with that. And keep in mind that you can get these supports in any setting. Okay, so going through placement, your child's school placement needs to provide their IEP program and services. So I know I've said this a few times. The reason we say this a lot is that schools often say, well, we don't do that here. They're not supposed to be saying that if it's something that they can provide. Central DOE should be helping them provide the program at that school. There's times, of course, it doesn't work. And so I think a lot of this training is going through, here's what your rights are, and then here's what reality is, and how to try to bridge that gap sometimes. So in terms of finding out about placement, the mechanics of where am I going to school, one of the most common ways is that students now, and this wasn't true when I first started, but it's been true for, many years now. For District 1 through 32 schools, parents are applying. So if you're going into kindergarten, if you're going into middle school or 6th grade, or high school, 9th grade, you go through an application process and you apply to DOE schools. We have other trainings on this that we do every year for all of those. But if you go through the application process, you'll get an admission offer to a school from there. There's also, you get a school location letter. The DOE is required to send these. They don't always seem to, but like, for example, if you get placed, my son went to a DOE high school with an ICT program. We got an admissions offer. I don't think we got a school location letter, but I knew where he was going to school and I knew that they had that program. But a school location letter, will show you a picture of it, is a more official form. And it comes with something called a prior written notice. And that's required by law that you get that. And then also you can get placements, some of the programs I described earlier, like the bilingual special ed or ASD programs, you might get a placement letter, or you would get a placement letter from central offices. And you'll only get a placement letter if you're going to a new placement. So for example, if your child's in 2nd grade and they're in gen ed and they get an IEP for the first time and it recommends an ICT program, you may get a school location letter and a placement letter, but you might not, because you're staying at that school. Nobody is anticipating that you're leaving school. You're just changing from one classroom to another. So I think, we just went through this a little bit, but in terms of how you get admissions offers, District 1 through 32, you're getting them if you go through the application process, you're getting an admissions offer. If you're starting a new school, and it's a different, like, let's say you're in 2nd grade, that same example I gave, and instead of recommending an ICT, you're in your local zone school, but they think you need a District 75 program and you agree, you would get a new placement recommendation then, a new school location letter. Or if you move, like you're moving to a different area, or you're at a school that closes, or there's a lot of different reasons why somebody might no longer be able to stay at their school placement, you would get a new school location letter. You can check for offers that come through the admissions process. You can check online at myschools.nyc. And in fact, I think other offers should show up there as well. And you can also call the DOE at this number, 718-935-2009. Okay. Okay, so this is an example of what the school location letters look like. They both say prior written notice of recommendation, but as you can see on the white one on the left just describes the kind of program. So it's saying that the student is recommended for an ICT program with OT, PT, and speech. And then the one on the right has the actual school location letter. It's green. This is an example of a kindergarten school location letter. Those are green. The other grades are not. But it says that it's for the Briarwood School, PS 117. And so that's where you can see what the actual school is and who to contact. Okay. So, and we're going to do a quick trivia question, and then we're going to go into questions. So the question is, the school listed on your IEP, let me move this. The school listed on your school location letter may be different than the school you made an admissions offer, that made you an admissions offer through the D1 through 32 process. And we'll give people, this is sort of an advanced question, but we'll see what people think. I have to admit, I was a little stumped by this, and I've been doing this for a long time. And then when Betty explained it, I was like, oh yeah, that is exactly how this would go. All right, so people are still voting and changing. Okay, I think it's mostly, most people got it right. It is true. It's not always so usual, but what would come up, for example, is this may come up especially for a student that's entering kindergarten. You had your IEP for kindergarten and you went through the school application process. You got your school application kindergarten offer for PS 117, for example, but then through the IEP process, they decided to recommend a Horizon program. PS 117 doesn't have it. That is one of the centralized outside the admissions processes offers. So you would get a separate offer on your school location letter that made you an offer for a program that, for a placement that had that ASD Horizon program. So this really comes up, especially when you're recommended for your IEP has changed, or you're recommended for a program that comes outside of that admissions process. I'm going to pause here just to check in with Betty and see if there's any questions that we need to have answered now.
Thanks so much, Kim. I think the only active question right now is one that we just received in the Q&A. Isn't the law that if a child needs a small class in a school and the school doesn't have one, that they're required to open one?
So that's complicated. So I think that is general DOE policy, that they want schools to serve all students. The problem is, in reality, and this is something that's very frustrating for us as advocates, that isn't always true. And the law actually requires that you get a placement that can that can provide your program, but it doesn't mean you have a right to a particular school. And as we know, as New York City parents, there's some schools that are super sought after and other schools that are less so. And let's say you get into super sought after popular school, but they don't have the class on your child's IEP, you may or may not be able to stay at that school. They were going to get into what happens, what kind of class did the DOE, fail to meet their timelines? Do you have any remedies? But you may end up at a different placement. So that's a great question. It's one of the most common questions on our helpline. And if you go to school, open houses, some of them are real open about, we don't do that here, and they shouldn't be saying that, but they do sometimes. Other schools say the sort of DOE line of everyone should be served everywhere, but the reality falls in between those two. And I would say at Advocates for Children, when we're working with parents and working with Central DOE, we have seen schools open up classes to class programs, like create small classes or create an ICT because there's students at a school who need one. But I also have seen them not be able to do that. And school principals have to go through a process where they justify why they can't open a program. And sometimes Central DOE will provide them resources to make them open a program. Sometimes there's not room in a school. Sometimes there's not enough students with that same need. And that's where it can get complicated. And the one thing I would recommend is whatever the decision is, as a parent, make sure that you are making sure everyone is keeping their eye on what your child needs. It's not what the school needs, it's what your child needs. It's not what the school has or what is convenient for that district. It's what your child needs. And so to keep pushing for that. And that you do have a right to. Okay, any other questions? It looks like these might be more particular that are coming in.
Yep. I'll be answering the other ones in the Q&A. With just
Okay.
as a general point to everyone participating, when we're talking about the ASD programs, those are specialized programs that Kim went over, the programs like AIM, NEST, and Horizon. That is a separate application process. If you apply to those programs and you receive an offer to one of those programs, then the specialized program office or the NEST Horizon AIMS office, they need to work to place your child in a school that has that setting, right? That has that program offered, because those programs are not available in all of the DOE schools. You do not get into those programs, even if you get an admissions offer to a school that has a specialized ASD program. That does not mean your child is admitted to that specialized program. They're admitted to the school generally, and to receive the services on their child's IEP. But just wanted to flag that as I go through and answer these questions, that it is a separate process that plays into this placement.
Thank you. Okay, so going through the timelines for 12-month placements. So this is for July and August. There's 4 different types of programs that are running in the summer. 12-month District 75 IEPs, and almost all, I guess not all, but almost all District 75 recommendations are for 12-month programs. There's also something called extended school year for District 1 through 32 programs. So if your child is in a District 1 through 32 school, but needs 12-month program, you can ask for that and they can recommend it. There's a section in the IEP where they talk about, does your child need 12-month services? This is actually something that the DOE for years did not provide, but they have provided more and more. It's still a pretty small number, but we have seen it growing. Not every school has 12-month programs. In fact, there's usually only a handful of schools in each borough that provide it, but you can ask for it. And this is a question that does come up. You have to show for 12-month program recommendations that your child would substantially regress. In other words, they need this to keep moving. All students regress a bit over the summer, but if your child has a disability where they're going to regress further than the typical child, then that's something where you might be able to ask for this. Also, summer school is something. This is not, in fact, summer school, unfortunately, often does not have supports for students with disabilities. It should, and you can ask for them, but it may not be the same kind of setting. Like they're not going to have a 12-to-1 in summer school. It may naturally be a smaller group setting, but this is something where people do sometimes push for more special education support, maybe a SETS teacher if the summer school teacher is a gen ed teacher. But those are programs that are going on now. And then finally, Summer Rising. The asterisk is here because Summer Rising is not guaranteed. It's relatively new as well. It's something where I think that the DOE has recognized the fact that many students need more support over the summer. summer. And I think one area of improvement for them would be making all of this make more sense for students with disabilities. But summer rising is something where you apply, and if you win the lottery, then you get a spot at it. And that's something that it started a lot earlier this year. With all of these, the timeline here is something that this can change. So these are very rough timelines, and they can change every year. This year, the summer rising was a lot earlier. Typically you find out about summer rising in May, but it could be June. This year applications, I think, were in April, so they were earlier. If your student is being held over for summer school, you should be getting notice that that's a possibility way earlier in the school year, but you would find out where you're going to summer school in June. June 15th is the deadline for District 75 placements, and ESY placements. So they should be making an offer by then. That's one that the DOE has argued they don't have to. It was in their procedures for many years. It's not something that's clearly legally mandated, but certainly you always have a right to a placement, obviously before the start of school. And if they're going to set up busing, which is typically the case for students in District 75 or ESY placements, practically speaking, you really need to have an offer by June 15th to know what the bus is and to get all of that moving. Okay, so 10-month placement for September to June. 10 months, there's 10-month IEPs with programs. There's 10-month specialized programs like the ones that we went through before. Students entering kindergarten, and entering middle school and high school. So these are different buckets of groups that might have different timelines. April to May is typically when the application matches come out, for kindergarten, elementary, or high school. There is a wait list, so you can get an offer earlier and then decide you want to stay on a wait list and not find out where you're going to school until even as late as the start of school in September. That wait list does move. June 15th is the deadline, and it's legally the deadline for incoming kindergarten students who had preschool IEPs. That's when they should be getting a recommendation for their special ed program. August 15th for a 10-month, if you're going to a new school for a 10-month program, you should be getting your offer by August 15th. That's also mandated. It's part of the June 15th and August 15th are deadlines in a class action called HOSAP. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And the specialized programs, it varies a little bit more. You obviously have a right to an offer that can implement your IEP, but sometimes those offers get made in the middle of the school year as well. Okay, and so I think I've already mentioned busing a lot. It's something that for all parents, it's really critical. They can have the most perfect IEP and a great placement, but if you can't get there, it's not going to do you very much good. So make sure that your IEP has, if your child needs specialized busing, that it has it on there. Check on the New York City school account to see what bus company is assigned. We do trainings on this every year, but it can take the DOE up to 10 school days to set up busing, and you want to be proactive. The bus company is supposed to call you, but it makes sense to be calling them and to make sure that it works out and that they have whatever your child needs. Okay, so what happens if the placement, the school that they recommend, does not have the IEP program? I know I've said this a number of times, but your child has a right to the IEP program. Assuming that IEP was created, agreed on, finalized, your child has a right to that program. And the school should provide it. This was that person's question earlier. But then there's reality. Sometimes they don't have it. The clear legal obligation is that the DOE has to give you a placement that can implement the IEP. So that can involve either making the school where you are create that program or offering you a different school that can implement the IEP. And so one question that comes up a lot is, well, how do I know? My child has an ICT and I want them to go, I am applying through high school and I want to make sure they're at a high school that has the ICT. Now, yes, every high school should create an ICT if that's what your child needs, but then some of us get exhausted from fighting the DOE and want to try to find a school ahead of time that we think has an ICT, has experience with ICTs. One of my most favorite public reports is this school level or class size data. That's what this is. And you want to click on detailed school level data. This link that we will send around, you can also just Google class size reports, gets you to that page. They do update this once a year. It doesn't mean it's 100% accurate, but it is a really good way to see in broad strokes what a school has. It's listed by district and then by the school and then by the number of sections in a school and how big those sections are. So we didn't include in this, and one thing I should warn you, it's a monster Excel sheet. It's very big. So, don't try it on your phone. I mean, you can, but it's pretty big. But when you open it up, you can really find out. You can't find out if a school has, a 12-to-1 or a 12-to-1-to-1. It's just going to say small class or SC. But you can find out, do they have gen ed? Do they have ICT? Do they have it in, this is a middle school that we're looking at. That's what the MS stands for. This middle school looks like they have a lot. They have a lot of ICT classes and they have a lot of self-contained classes. It's probably a bigger school, but it can give you a sense as to what's being offered. Now, you should be able to call a school and ask, and some schools will be very upfront. Some schools won't be, or you might not be able to reach someone. And this is, one publicly available source of information for what a school has offered, at least in the past. Okay. Any questions coming in now, Betty, that you think we should take here?
Yes. So we have a question in the chat with respect to high school specifically. Katie says that she works with parents who receive calls from a DOE high school a week or so before school is scheduled to start, and the high school is telling them that they cannot provide either the small class size or the ICT that's recommended on the child's IEP, and they request that the family waive their rights to those programs. And Katie is asking, how do we help families receive the accommodations that meet their child's needs?
So that, for example, is something that I feel like this is could be the subheading of this training. That should not happen. That doesn't sound legal. And it also is something we see all the time. And the reality is there's a real shortage of special education high school teachers. So teachers that are certified in a particular subject in high school, like science, and also our special ed teachers. And so the reality is not all high schools can offer all programs. However, and this is me speaking as somebody for Advocates for Children, I think more high schools can offer more than what they do now. So that's a tough question, and it does become, how much can you push the school? And I do think parents should certainly not, based on that question and the wording of it, if somebody's just saying, we don't have that here, you have to waive it, I think you say, let's have a meeting about it now. And possibly call up the chain to Central DOE about it as well. You do not have to waive anything. You have a legal right to what's on that IEP. What's hard is when you get that call, the third week of August, what are you going to do about it at that point? It's why, if it's possible, it would make sense to have those conversations in the spring when you're applying to schools. and when you're trying to think about what would be a good match. But the reality is this happens all the time, even to parents that were very involved and asking questions. And I think to push back, if there's 10 parents who say no, then that school really needs to create an ICT for them if they all need ICT, for example, or a small class. And so I think that what I would say is, make sure you have all the proof for what your child needs. I would talk to the school about what they can provide. One thing that should not happen, and actually we don't have a slide about this, but we see it a little bit less this year, but it comes up sometimes, is school professionals telling parents, you have to go find a school that can meet your child's IEP program. So you, parent, go to the Family Welcome Center and ask them to give you a school. And then the parent goes to the Family Welcome Center, and the Family Welcome Center says, no, 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 the school has to provide what's on your IEP program. And the parent ends up in this circle, going from the school telling them to go to the Family Welcome Center, and the Family Welcome Center telling them to go to the school. And that is not legal. That should not be happening. We'll go through how to go up the chain, but that's something that you want to do in that case, because that shouldn't happen. Certainly, if you find a school that can provide your child's program and you want to go there, you can push to be transferred, but it's not your responsibility as a parent. It's the DOE's responsibility to provide you a placement that can implement your IEP. So I know that may not be the most satisfactory answer, because there's the law and then there's what happens, and it's very frustrating for parents. Okay. Okay, so going through problem solving, which that was a great question to transition into this. So makeup services, let's say that the school says, we don't have a small class. And you go on the first day of school and they say, we are not creating a small class for you. You can go to the Family Welcome Center, you can go somewhere else, but we don't do that here. If you don't get the small class on your IEP in a timely way, so by August 15th, or for a student going into kindergarten, certainly by June 15th, or you go to a school and they don't have that program, you're entitled to something called a P1 letter. It also gets called a Nickerson letter. It's basically a voucher that lets you go to a state-approved non-public school for 1 year. So we're going to go through this a little bit. So it's not a permanent thing, although we do find that often students stay once they get placed at a school, but it's not a guarantee. And also, it is a lot of work as a parent, because you have to find the NPS, or the non-public school, that will accept your child, that's licensed for that classification. The program won't be exactly the same. So for example, if you were going into high school with a 15:1, maybe you find a non-public school that has a 12:2 ratio. That's close enough. It should be okay. But that's one type of voucher you can get. You can also get, if they recommend a school that has your IEP program in terms of the educational class program, but they don't have all the related services, or they don't have sets, you're entitled to these 2 other vouchers, RSAs for related services. The provider must be licensed within New York State, and the same for SETS, or special education teacher support services, where also the provider must be licensed. With both of those, the rates are low. So if you can't find someone, ask for an increased rate. All of them, especially the P1, have expiration dates. So make sure you're checking those. So the Nickerson, or the P1R, or sometimes it's just called P1, is one of the more common things we get asked about. You're entitled to that if they miss the deadline for giving you a new special class. I think I talked through this a bit in the last slide, but just to go through it again here. For 12-month programs, it's June 15th, or at the very least by the beginning of the school year. For 10-month programs, if they didn't mail you a placement offer by August 15th, and for kindergarten, if there's no placement mailed to you by June 15th, and also mid-year placements, sometimes people get recommended for a small class in the middle of the year. It's 60 school days from the date of the referral. And one thing to keep in mind, to emphasize, this is not for ICT or Gen Ed. It's if you're recommended for a special class. In other words, one of those ones on the continuum that's like a 12-to-1 or a 15-to-1. And another very typical thing that comes up is if the placement offer doesn't have the right program. I know people have already been asking that question, but you go to a school, you think they were going to have your small class, and they don't. Try to get proof of that, and then you can ask for a Nickerson letter, and we'll go through at the end. If you're having trouble, certainly feel free to reach out to Advocates for Children. You do have to find a non-public school that will accept you. They must be able to serve that classification. And they must have the related services. This is frustrating because a lot of DOE schools don't have related services, but they either have to have the related services or explain convincingly why they're worked into the system. So some schools, maybe they don't have counseling, but the whole program is therapeutic and they have a counselor that's leading parts of classes, something like that. And they have to have a similar class ratio. So some strategic things that come up with a P1R is that it's only good for 1 year. I know I talked about this, but that's hard. By the way, if you get one after March 15th, you can use it for the following school year. So it's not like you get one on June 25th and it's good for 5 days. No, you can use it after March 15th for the next school year, but not for the school year after that. You can only use it for approved schools. It does expire, so sometimes when we're asking for a P1, it will have an expiration date of a few weeks. And at the same time, they also, when I get to Central DOE, they say, okay, here's your Nickerson letter or your P1 letter, but also we found a school that can implement your IEP. That expiration date is real. You can still use it if you find a non-public school and you like it more than the public program the DOE has recommended, but you have to get through the process with the NPS being approved before the expiration date. Also, one thing to keep in mind is you still have a right to public placement, and you can ask for both a Nickerson and a public placement. And I often do. So sometimes I have parents who really want a public placement. They don't want to have to go through the whole routine of finding a non-public school, or there isn't one that's close to them and they really want something that is closer to where they live. You can ask for both, and in my experience, the DOE will try really hard. I mean, the DOE always tries hard, but they're going to try really hard to find a public school that works for you because they don't want to pay for the private school. When should you not ask for a Nickerson letter? So this comes up, and this is getting into sort of legal strategy and what makes sense. So certainly there's no way to give you an answer generally, but I do think if you're looking at a non-approved private school, so there's two kinds of private schools. Approved, meaning you can get it on an IEP and the New York State Education Department pays the school, or non-approved, which in New York City, there's a lot of them, meaning they don't take money. The only way to get they don't take money from the state directly. The only way to get them paid is to go through an impartial hearing. And I'm not saying in any way that those schools are better or worse. They're just different. And sometimes that's the only kind of school that you found that will work for your child. You might not want to ask for a Nickerson letter, even if you didn't get your small class. And this is something that you're going to want to talk to an attorney about and get their opinion on your case. But one of the things that happens when you ask for a Nickerson is you may also get a public school placement. And is that going to make your case for a non-approved school harder? For the same thing, if you're not really sure if you want approved or non-approved, I would be talking to an advocate or an attorney and being careful about asking for a Nickerson. And this is tricky. It's something where I can't sit here and say this is the right answer for everybody. But just keep in mind, if you don't want a public school, then is asking for a P1, does that make sense? Unless you have a non-public school that's approved that you think you can use one at. Okay, so requesting a P1R, it's supposed to be automatic, but it almost never is. And this is not legal, but it's reality. If you don't get one and you think you're entitled to one, you can ask through Nickersons at schools.nyc.gov, and also copy special education at schools.nyc.gov. Give them your child's name, date of birth, and explain why you think you're entitled to a Nickerson. If that does not work, please reach out to AFC through our helpline, or you can fill out a contact form on our webpage, and we can try to help. Okay, so let's say there's something else. You really want your child to stay at this school placement, but there's a problem. You have ICT in 3 out of the 4 subjects. You should always start with the school, talk to the parent coordinator, the principal. If that doesn't work, you can go to the superintendent's office, to the family support coordinator or the district family advocate. You can go to DOE Central, the Office of Special Education. Or finally, this is the superintendent contact information, and you can go there. Keep records of everything. Email is great because it's in writing and it's date stamped and you can keep it. But if you have conversations, make sure you're keeping a log. If none of that works, you do have rights under the law to more formal dispute resolutions, so you can do a mediation, which means it's voluntary, so both you and the school have to agree, and the parent and the DOE discuss the problem. A mediator facilitates, and you can sometimes work things out. And that tends to be very good if you want to stay at a school and you just want, or if a parent, the main problem is the parent and a teacher, or the parent and the principal are really talking past each other. Sometimes mediation can help. Other times you really need to file an impartial hearing. If you want a non-approved private school, you have to file an impartial hearing. You cannot get that through mediation, at least not in New York City at this time. So that's something where you file a complaint online, an impartial hearing officer is assigned. It's an administrative type hearing, but it can feel pretty formal. You get a written decision based on witnesses and documents. You have a right to appeal. We have a guide on how to file impartial hearings. We do see more and more parents doing this on their own, but it can be pretty legal. So it may be something, if you have the resources, to try to find an attorney or to call through AFC and see if we can help. Finally, this is true for all of the things that we mentioned, but you have language access rights. So parents have a right to get documents translated, including report cards and IEPs. You also have a right to interpretation, and meaning professional interpretation. They can't ask, your older child to come and translate, or something like that, to professional interpretation services at school meetings and events. And that's in the top languages. If you have problems with translation or interpretation, you can write to hello@schools.nyc.gov or call the DOE complaint line at 718-935-2013. Okay, and so finally I'm going to keep answering questions. And if you can take our poll that Betty will launch, that really helps us. It helps us with our funders if you can tell us how we did. And also if you have suggestions for other things you want us to do trainings or develop resources on, we really do read these. So I appreciate everyone that can take this and let us know. It's 4 short questions, yes and no, and then 3 broader ones where we just want to know what worked. Do you have more questions? And what trainings would you like us to do in the future? Okay, so that's the end of the training. Betty, are there other questions you'd like to raise now?
Yep, just one that came up, I think, when we were talking about high school accommodations. And the question is in the chat, just how likely is it, I believe, to get sets providers for high school students, specifically at an enhanced rate?
It is such a good question. So, certainly you can ask for a sets provider to be provided by the DOE during the school day. And that's something where, if you're going up the chain, they should do that. It's on your IEP. They're not providing it. You can keep pushing for it. In terms of the enhanced rate, there's a lot of litigation and policy changes going on right now about that. And there's a good reason for it, because the sets rate is ridiculously low. And I don't mind that this is being recorded. I think the DOE knows it's ridiculously low. It's $47.50 an hour. There's a new relatively new research study that came out that said the actual market rate for sets is $125 an hour. And then in reality, what we've seen is many sets providers charge even more. If you're going for a much higher rate, you may have to file a hearing to get it. That shouldn't be the case, and you should be able to ask and go up the chain. But the reality is you might have to file a hearing to go to hearing, and this is a whole other training on that, but just keep in mind, in terms of getting it, you'd want to show, I asked the DOE on these occasions, I called these 25 providers. These are the people who answered. These are the people who answered who could see my child when I needed them to be seen, who had experience in high school algebra or whatever it is that you need sets in. And this is what their rate is. And that would be important both for asking the DOE generally and for going to hearing. And I would say, I think the ground is shifting on this. It used to be, pre-COVID, it was pretty easy to get a P3 at an enhanced rate. I think it has gotten easier up to a certain point, and if you're going over the $125 hour, a lot harder. And I wish I had, a better sense as to why the DOE agrees sometimes and doesn't others, but I don't. So I guess that's as best of an answer as I can give you right now. Any other questions that have come up?
Just from the same person,
Okay.
if there's a new ERES unit, ERES unit for private schools, but not for public schools.
That's correct. And I find that super interesting. And when I first was reading about it, it was not clear. And I don't know much about ERIS because it's brand new. The enhanced rate educational services. I don't remember what all the letters stand for. And it's because so many students at private non-DOE schools, like parochial schools or yeshivas. So they were not asking the DOE to pay tuition, but they were asking for the comparable services. We're asking for sets because the DOE was not providing them with sets. They were asking for them at an increased rate. And I think there's been a lot of controversy and public controversy about that because there were a lot of scandals with some fraud. The hard part with that is there's still many students who absolutely need these services. Everyone knows they need these services and they're kind of caught in the middle. So I think that's where the DOE, my guess is that's what they were trying to do, but it's unfortunate if they set up a system for students outside the public school system. But if you're in the public school system, you still have to go through a pretty arduous hearing process. There is a suggestion at the Regents level to deny students with IESPs, so not IEPs. It stands for oh my goodness, I can't even remember all of a sudden what IESP stands for. But what it means is you are not in a DOE school. You're in a private school your parents pay for. And you're asking for comparable services for your child with a disability. So you don't have an IEP, you have an IESP. And students who are homeschooled also have IESPs. There's a proposal that they not be allowed to go through a hearing process. And that's perplexing to me, but it's, you know, something that they're talking about. And my guess is that's where ERIS came up, is that they know they have to provide something for these families to actually get services. And both public school students and students educated outside the public school system have trouble getting all the special education services and related services that they need. So it's a big problem, and it's a good question. Okay. Anything else? Well, thank you to everyone that took the survey. And thanks for coming. I hope this was helpful. Okay.